environment?
Good things grow slowly. You need, I think, a generous sort of organic on-ramp for something that's going to get big. It doesn't necessarily start big. And I think the thing that's going to get big is not necessarily, although of course I have great hopes for Luminor, not necessarily so much our imprint in itself as the incredible groundswell of interest in Catholic and in Christian literary scenes and works and contexts. I think all of this is going to start exploding over the next few years, and I'm just grateful to be a part of that in some small way.
That's really cool. Why don't we just keep right on going? Because I really want to understand a bit more about what you just said right there. Like, you think it's going to keep exploding next couple of years. Could you share why? Why do you think there's this groundswell and why things are primed to really take off?
We have been seeing, I think, over the last 20 years or so, reversal of a trend, which I think was pretty well entrenched when I was coming up, when I was getting my undergrad degree and considering graduate school for the first time. The options for writers who were conscious of their Christian faith and it found that to be an important part of their artistic identity, the options were really thin on the ground. There were a couple places you could go. There were a couple publishing houses that were openly known to be friendly with that. Just the opportunities were fairly thin, and I think there was a perception that if you wanted to really make it, if you wanted to really have success as a literary writer of uncompromising value and of uncompromising aesthetic value and of uncompromising faith, then you would have to background the faith part. You would have to sort of, as I was told by one instructor, overtly, you would have to check that at the door. You would have to leave it outside. It was a kind of baggage that you weren't supposed to carry. It was going to negatively influence your writing, and pretty much only negatively. I think it wasn't envisioned that your faith could be a positive influence on your literary quality as a writer. But then over the last, I want to say, since about 2012, and I think since even before Paul Eli's Has Fiction Lost Its Faith piece in the New Yorker, earlier that year, about 6 months before that piece came out, you had the release of Christopher Bea's What Happened to Sophie Wilder, which I think marks this kind of watershed moment where the tide starts to turn in favor of serious treatment of matters of faith in a literary manner, with all of the investment in technique, all of the investment in artistry that you can bring from the literary sphere, and yet turning that technique and that artistry toward what I've heard Bea call matters of ultimate concern. I think the phrase comes from Kant ultimately, and maybe has a provenance before him as well. But you see, right, this surging back. And it's slow, right? It rolls out slowly. His next novel, Arts and Entertainments, is in 2014, and if anything, it's more Catholic than What Happened to Sophie Wilder. Has written or talked and written about, and is going to be releasing a memoir next year about his own journey back toward faith, as a consequence and part of having worked on these artistic projects over the last few years. You've got this just genuine, not very much noticed in the mainstream, but these just an explosion of novels that are doing extremely well in the mainstream on their own terms. You've got Phil Klei's Missionaries, you've got Kirsten Valdez-Quaid's The Five Wounds, Alice McDermott's The Ninth Hour and Absolution, not to mention behind me here on the shelf, Jan Fasse's Septology, which he just recently won the Nobel Prize. And he's a writer who underwent a religious conversion midstream in his own literary career. He began as a dramatist. He was extraordinarily successful in Europe. He turned toward writing fiction, and I want to say it was also 2012, although don't, here I am recording of saying, don't quote me on that. That's my memory. It could be faulty. But he returned to, I think in his case, not returned. Pase had not been religious growing up. He had been brought up in a very secular environment. And just by his encounters with the natural world and with his own efforts to make art, determined that there must be something more. There must be something bigger and more real. There's something beyond me that grounds my being. I come from somewhere and I'm going somewhere, right? That this became a sort of ground of his understanding of himself as an artist. And he almost wrote his way in to the church by means of perceiving the world around him and perceiving the nature of humanity. Which is fascinating to me, without preparation for that, without a sort of external force pulling him in that direction, and yet that's where he ended up. And septology, for those who aren't familiar, is about an artist who is devoutly Catholic, and he's a painter, a visual artist, and everything he does, even he's somewhat of an abstract artist, but also there are figurative elements to his painting, and at the same time, everything that he does is in some way colored or filled in or given context or given life by his faith. And he talks quite a bit about this shining darkness that he encounters both when he paints
Wow.
and in which he has to see his paintings in order to know if they're good or not, if they meet the sort of aesthetic criteria that he has for himself. So if we look at that concept of the shining darkness, it chimes very much with what the mystics say, right? From Julian of Norwich and the anonymous author of The Cloud of Unknowing, all the way up through St. John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila, right? This dark night of the soul that's a part of the illuminative way, all right, of union, our journey toward God. He seems to be experiencing this, but in an aesthetic mode. And I could talk all day about how that plays out in the novel itself, but also as a concept, as something that as believers we have to grapple with. But I think it speaks uniquely to artists. It speaks uniquely to people who experience life as being made in the image of a maker and being ordered toward making things. There's something about that that's profoundly connatural, as Jacques Maritain would say, and we have to account for in ourselves, even if we're starting from a place of sort of naturalism, if we're starting from a place of thinking, okay, well, we're just going to deal with the nature of art, we're just going to deal with the nature of craft, of the made thing in itself. It turns out you almost can't do that without running into the spiritual.
I have so many questions, but we don't have time for all of them. Sure. So I do want to ask you about little bit of your own story and the fact that you've written a novel and a collection of short stories, and you were the editor for Dappled Things, I think, and now you're heading up Luminor as this wonderful project through Word on Fire. I have to admit, Bishop Barron's, his YouTube channel from the old days, where he would engage with movies and so on, that's what inspired me to want to take creativity more seriously and actually have this community that we have with LegendFiction. So I trace a direct line back to him and his inspiration from a decade ago. So it's cool to kind of sort of close the loop a little bit and have a connection with you. But before coming back and asking about this other stuff, I still would love to understand maybe how you see it. You've talked about the fact that there are these shifts and this interest in the culture, and the fact that people want more of this kind of content. And I'm just curious if you have a sense why is there now a shift back to it? Why are people wanting it at all? Because at the same time, you've got Netflix and you've got everything that is being thrown at us from media, and all of a sudden you can launch a project like Luminor and go, yeah, we definitely know people want this sort of thing, and now we got to figure out what this is and how to get it to them. But why do you think now there's resurgence of interest, not just among creators, right, but among the readers?
There's a turn back toward a desire for the real. We, of course, can access all this, excuse me, all this amazing, terrible word, content. We can click or tap, and everything is shiny and colorful and accessible and easy and frictionless. And I think this ease is itself a little bit not responding to the deepest desires that we have. I think we have something in us that wants challenge, that wants to grapple with difficult questions, and not to just be entertained, and not to just have sort of a flood of background noise coming into our feeds and our screens, and not to be encountering things as flat, but to really deal with the texture and the richness and the fullness of life. And for my money, there's nothing that does that as well as the technology of the novel. Your own imagination, as I've heard children observe, is often better than the image that you could see on the screen. It's more satisfying to you because you're co-creating it. There's something in you that's engaged by that, that's not engaged by watching images flicker by on a screen. So if you can wake up that part of yourself, if you can engage your own mind in that way, I think a lot of people are hungry for that. And increasingly, the more our attention is sort of fragmented and fractured and chopped up into these tiny micropixels by all the technologies that we're sort of required to attend to on a daily basis, the more we need that return to something that's more in keeping with the nature of our bodies and our brains, and our need to unplug and get away from the constant hum and buzz of the digital. And no.
Wow. I mean, God, you have to stop saying interesting things because we're never going to get to the other questions. You said something cool. The technology of the novel. I've never thought of it that way. Could you just take 30 seconds and unpack why you use that turn of phrase?
Yeah, totally. Long story short, I went to St. Louis University. Father Walter Ong, a Jesuit priest, is very influential there. He was an influence on Marshall McLuhan, among others. And McLuhan's big on technologies of communication, the medium being the message, right? We don't think of the printed book as a technology anymore, but in fact, that's what it is. It is something that human beings have invented to meet a need. And the need in that case was to many things: communicate, right? Record observations. In some sense, there was a social function to the novel. It was sort of normative for many centuries, right? It's maybe not that anymore, but it is at least still a valid aesthetic form that people use to capture observations and capture a sense of life. And you really can't do that kind of capturing with any other aesthetic form. Not that other aesthetic forms don't have their virtues and their values. They do, of course. But the novel does something unique, and I think it's something worth preserving. I think the novel is kind of this unique product of a Christian consciousness that's persisting even as society becomes more and more secularized. It's sort of existing at the intersection of these two phenomena in a really fascinating way. And again, we don't have time to really dig into that observation, but I think that's why it continues to be relevant for us, even in our technological moment.
Fascinating, because that opens an entire side quest rabbit hole into the idea of authors as spiritual engineers. I don't know where that goes, but that's very intriguing. Okay, can we come back? I'd like to hear a little bit more about, if I may, we've got about in the next 10 minutes, a little bit about your story and how you ended up at Luminor. And then we'll talk about the dream for Luminor. And I think there's a contest even running as of this recording. So a couple of members in our Legend Fiction community have been hyped about it, and they're writing towards entering it and being a part of that. But a little bit of your story, and how did you get to where you are now?
Sure. Any version of that story has to start with my education, and with I think with friendship too. So I have wanted to be a writer ever since I was very young. I had wonderful teachers, including in high school. One in particular who really encouraged me and sort of sent me onward. At the same time as I was studying under her, I was beginning to have all of these questions about, can you be an artist of faith? Can you think about your writing in this way and not have it become this sort of easy messaging, this sort of commercial version of the faith. It's sort of sanitized and made easy to consume. That I wanted to preserve sort of the challenge, the difficulty, the risk, right, that's involved in belief, and and also write excellent things. Of course, there was a lot of great stuff out there to discover, from Flannery O'Connor to Alice McDermott and onward, in that vein. But I went to St. Louis University, started not long after that to freelance. I was working already on the manuscript that would become As Earth Without Water. I encountered Dappled Things magazine just by serendipity. A friend sent me the link and said, "Hey, I think this looks like something you would be interested in." I had a couple poems in the first edition. During that year after graduation, when I was freelancing, I was in touch quite a bit with the editorial board, with the conversations that were starting to blossom from that work already then. They invited me on to the editorial board in 2007, but later that year I became editor-in-chief for the first time. It took a little hiatus when my children were all very young, and then came back to the role in 2017. So I just handed that responsibility off to the editor of Chrism Press, Rhonda Ortiz, who's doing a really lovely job with it. I'm really proud of Rhonda and happy to see that coming together. But the founder, Bernardo Aparicio, through the work together, we've become great friends. I'm incredibly grateful to him. I think he's an undersung hero of the Catholic literary renaissance. Same story with Joshua Wren, the editor at Wise Blood Books, who started out as managing editor at Dappled Things around the time when I was on hiatus, when I think he was most active in that. But still, there was some correspondence, and just the context of people who encountered this one little publication and who went, "What, you too? I thought I was the only one." And as C.S. Lewis says, and from this, there just grew, right, this context, this community that has sort of sprouted out many branches that are going in many directions. It's not too hard to think of it as a giant tree, like in Tolkien's story, right, that's branching out in all these directions and has all these leaves, and each leaf is unique, and yet they're all related in some way.
It's a perfect segue then into Luminor being this just beautiful metaphor of the pine seed being activated by fire. And could you share with us what the germ of the genesis was for Luminor, and then where it is now?
So I can't take credit for the pine cone metaphor. That is all the designer, Nick Frederickson, who took what I wanted to do with the light imagery, and we wanted to engage the concept of luminaria, but we wanted to get a little bit out beyond that too, something that might have more broad suggestions, more of kind of a encompassing of the natural as well as the human made, right? The first luminaria we learned, not the first luminaria ever, but some of the first luminaria that were lit in America would have been in the American Southwest, would have been lit with pine cones in this way, because those are the available materials, right?
For those of us who have no idea what luminaria are because you've never heard of it before 30 minutes ago studying the website, what is luminaria?
They are tiny festival lanterns in Europe, South America, in many places in America too. You'll see them laid out in patterns in public squares, around churches. They're associated with the Christmas season mostly, but you see them at other times as well. In South America, I understand in certain places they're called velitas or farolitos, right? Depending on where you live, they might have different names. But they are, I love the image because they are this lovely cross-cultural tradition. There's something that sort of is out in the public square, welcoming people in, saying, "Look what beauty our faith is capable of nurturing, and what welcome we're capable of offering at our best." So that really spoke to me, and we dug a little deeper into that. And it was, as I said, Nick Frederickson who came up with the lovely pine cone logo, which I'm so thrilled with.
So what kind of content are you looking for people to submit and send in, and what do you dream of Luminor becoming?
At the moment, we are open to novels, collections of short stories, collections of poetry. I'm looking for full length rather than chapbook length. If folks know what that is, it's easy to look up. Just, are you going to be able to make a full book out of this, or is it going to be something that's relatively small? We're looking for the full length book. And then works of literary criticism or creative nonfiction like memoir, essays about culture, about books, about art. Book length, either a single book length essay or collections of essays we would love to see in print that in some way are encompassing the Christian and Catholic ethos, right, that are centered on Christ, but that can branch out and explore as well in this horizontal dimension, as well as being rooted in the vertical.
Kind of content are you not looking for people to send in, or that is not a good fit for your editorial requirements at this time?
Right now, I think I can say that I have received a number of young adult manuscripts that I think, if that's what somebody's interested in, right? I mean, obviously there's a fantastic market out there for those works. Not that they're bad. It's not that there's anything wrong with writing in that vein, but it's not what I'm looking for. I am looking for literary work that's geared to an adult audience. Generally educated doesn't have to be that anyone is a literary specialist. It doesn't have to be that they're academic in that sense, right? This is literature for everyone, but literature for readers of any faith or none who are interested in understanding better the Catholic vision of life. Right. And I'm taking a fairly expansive view of that. But at the same time, you're sort of dialing toward more toward the adult than the young adult audience.
So exciting. Where can people find you online? You for your books, but then also for Luminor.
So I have a couple books out, as you mentioned, with Wise Blood, as well as a short monograph on the work of Christopher Beha. And I have an introduction in this lovely little volume, not little, but it's the prefaces of Henry James, and I wrote an introduction to that for Wise Blood. So wisebloodbooks.com, you can go and look up my books. If you want to look at what we're doing with Luminor, please go to wordonfire.org/Luminor, and you can see where we have a story contest as well as the form to submit your manuscripts for consideration for the main print.
And I think that's a great place to wrap.
Thank you so